Welcome to the Unlist. Today we are going to have a spectacular, brief lowdown on a genre that is fairly ubiquitous in the world of men's market fragrances in particular, and that is the fougère, the almighty fougère. Not the fougère, hey man, what's a fougère? I want to get me some of them fougères. No. It's not a fougère. It's not a fougere or a fougère, it's a fougère. Now, even my pronunciation is probably incorrect because, the French have this lovely way of making everything sound halfway between lovemaking and throwing up, and I don't have that technique mastered really to do that simultaneous, kissing and vomiting sound when I go fougère like that. I can't really do that, so I'm not going there. So my French viewers, please forgive me. I don't have the mastery of my faculties up here on quite the same level you do, because I am a dumb American, and us dumb Americans do what dumb Americans do, and that's be dumb and be American. So again, apologies for that, but fougère, it's one of those things that if you are interested in men's market fragrances pretty much at all, you need to know about this genre. And it's also pretty impossible to do a comprehensive lowdown on this genre in under 20 minutes. So I'm not going to try. This is definitely the Cliff Notes version. And I've done live streams on Instagram in the past, and I leave most of my stuff up. So if you want something a little more historical in nature, a little more comprehensive, you can go to my Instagram and start digging up that stuff, and you'll probably find something on the fougère that'll run 2 hours and give you all the little itty-bitty details that you could possibly stomach. Probably more, honestly, more details than you frankly want, unless you're like me and you go down the rabbit hole and you're completely insane. And then you might want 2 hours of conversation about something as minute as genre and fragrances. But anyway, getting back to it. So, the fougère. One of the reasons why it's probably among the most ubiquitous genres of perfume sold to men, either at a men's fragrance counter or maybe just, drugstores where things are mixed together. And of course, there are a lot of fragrances that are not technically gendered, but are fougères. There are a lot of niche fragrances in particular, a lot of Indian artisanal fragrances that are labeled as fougère, but may not necessarily be marketed specifically to men. They might be more unisex, but leaning towards something that a guy might like more more so than say your conventional taste. Because when I say for men, for women, I'm not talking about all men, all women in a unilateral sense. I'm talking about conventional Western society tastes, conventional mindsets, the average Joe and Jane. So when I say for men, for women, I don't mean like an authority. I'm sure you guys know already, but people need these disclaimers. They need this caveat shit, or else they start to go debate me, bro. And again, I get Jordan Peterson, and I'm not really trying to get that. So I'm just throwing it out there that when I say for men, for women, I don't mean in an authoritarian sense here. This is just, lowest common denominator style thinking. So moving right along, as we were. The fougère, really the word fougère means fern. And there's actually a city in France called Fougères, which means ferns, right? And the thing about the fougère genre is, way back when it first shimmered into being, it had something to do with the whole late 19th century Victorians and La Belle Epoque and all those folks, Gilded Age if we're in the United States. They had this thing where they wanted to master the natural world. We are humans. We are the pinnacle of evolution. We want to control and rewrite and make things in our own image. We basically want to play God, right? That whole manifest destiny, exceptionalism garbage. So the thing is, we took a look at the fern. We're like, this looks really good. It looks really green and verdant, and it looks like something that should smell like that. But ferns, in fact, have very little noticeable smell. I mean, if you really you know, go really hard, you can probably smell something. Stick your face in a fern, you'll probably catch a little bit of this or that, but not a real distinct odor. So, you know, those stuck-up Victorians and Gilded Age folks were like, well, we'll have to change that. We'll have to make a scent. If the fougère, you know, or the fern were to have a scent, it would smell like this. And then, of course, we're going to make perfume, and we're going to make candles, and we're going to make powder and all that kinds of stuff, hair tonics, and we're going to scent it that way. And that's really what happened. That's how the fougère came about. The earliest examples were not uniform. They didn't follow a formula, so to speak. And you could almost tell because you would have some brands would use the Anglophone version. They'll, you know, you'll have like G.O.F. Trumper famously had a wild English fern in the 1800s. And then, of course, you know, you had various fougère fragrances too. And well, then a little fragrance from Parfum Houbigant came along called Fougère Royale, or Royal Fern. This fragrance came out in 1882, and it basically set a precedent. It created an archetype, and due to the general status of the house of Houbigant anyway, it was very well respected, esteemed house at that time. And then, of course, that led to the fragrance being popular and noteworthy. So then it kind of became the template that everyone else then decided to follow. And the perfumer is one Paul Parquet, who also owned Houbigant at that time. So not only was he like the president, CEO, you know, not only is he the president of Hair Club for Men, but he's also a client, right? That's kind of how it was. He owned the company, but he also was the perfumer. He devised a way of extracting more coumarin from tonka bean than typical previous tincture, maceration, infusion processes could generate. He discovered passing nitrogen gas over the beans could like suck out the coumarin and then isolate it, and then boom, you've got basically pure tonka, right? Not the Thierry Mugler pure tonka, but just, you know, pure tonka. So that stuff became the first isolate, the first synthetic material ever to be used in a fragrance, and he put it in Fougère Royale, right? He put it in Fougère Royale. So the rest of the fragrance, pretty standard stuff for the time, you know, bergamot and lemon up top, citrus oils before we had all these zippy acetates and aldehydes to play with. We just used good old-fashioned citrus oils. And then you had lavender and geranium in there because, you know, lavender has a certain soapiness, certain mintiness, certain green facet if it's used a certain way. The geranium kind of ups that a bit, dries it out further. Then there were some herbs in there. There's some clary sage. Clary sage kind of holds hands with tonka. So both clary sage and tonka can give you a hay-like, you know, petrichor, forest floor kind of vibe. Clary sage is a little bit drier though. Tonka is a little rounder. Tonka is also used, by the way, to cure tobacco with, which is the reason why a lot of tobacco fragrances are just made with tonka. They're not using real tobacco leaves, trust me, they're not. So there's, you know, holding hands once again. So that, and then of course we have the oak moss. Got to have the oak moss for that mossy, woody feel. And then there were some other things here and there. The older bottles had sandalwood and such in them. So Fougère Royale had this smooth, green, slightly clean, slightly floral, slightly herbal, woody, hay-like smell that, you know, drove guys at that time absolutely bonkers. So they went absolutely crazy for it. And then, of course, women liked Fougère Royale too, but, you know, men ended up outnumbering them. So before long, other companies would come along and create their own version of a fougère, and thus a genre was born, right? And then after that, we saw a lot of those products move down market into the wet shaving and grooming space, since wet shaving, the whole Victorian era, the whole dandy style, short hair, clean shaven face, was taking over, replacing beards and long hair. So the wet shaving was just in time to pair up with the fougère to deliver a fragrance that would kind of become, you know, ubiquitous due to its association with good grooming. See, that's the trick here. A lot of aftershave products that you may be familiar with have a fougère odor, including Skin Bracer by Menon from 1931. We would see Clubman Pinot in 1940 for that. So fougères in general, after the first one, didn't really pick up a whole lot of steam until probably after the 20th century came around. We would see, again, things from G.O.F. Trumper, Penhaligon's. We would see Pinot do some things as well. And Guerlain got in on it with Jicky, which wasn't really a full fougère. It was kind of a fougère adjacent style. But then, ironically, Jicky was fougérified into Bourgeois de Monsieur, which had a lot of the more oriental elements stripped out and replaced with more of the things that make it closer to fougère. So then we ended up with a true Guerlain fougère. Caron Pour Homme is not technically a true fougère. It's missing a lot of the key elements that make a fougère what it is, but again, it's an adjacent fragrance. And then Canois, 1936, by Dana Parfums, created by the legendary perfumer Jean Carles. So on and so forth. A lot of those old fougères, guys, were much different than what we now expect. They were much richer, much rounder. A lot of them had vanilla. A lot of them had other florals like heliotrope, clove. So they were much creamier, much sweeter, much thicker. They didn't have as much sharpness. You didn't start seeing that sharp green facet that you associate with fougère until probably the Italians. When the Italians got in on it, they created stuff like Silvestri by Victor, and then later Acqua di Selva, also by Victor, and then Pinot Silvestri by Vino Vidal, and it kept on going. Those were more what I call lucid fougères. They were more realistic. They were more lifelike. They much sharper lemon notes, much sharper bergamot. Pine played a big part in, especially with Pinot Silvestri by Lino Vidal, by the way. Lino Vidal, and then of course Acqua di Selva by Victor. Pine played a big part. Tonka was very dry. There was no vanilla in that Tonka, no sweetness in that Tonka. So just strict Tonka, pine, oak moss. Again, very forest floor, very green, very vivid. And then that's it. From there, the fougère kind of laid low for a while, because the sheep was taking over, and men's fragrances got much more in line with the sheep style, and then leather sheeps, aromatic sheeps, so on and so forth. All the sheeps go bah, as time goes on. But then the fougère came back into the 60s. We can blame that on a couple different people. Fabergé, with their Brut, was a big successful fragrance. It kind of brought the fougère back into vogue for men. And that was a much more floral and powdery version of a fougère. There were some women's fragrances that also could be called fougère as well. So let's not leave ladies out of this, I did a video recently about Vent Vert by Pierre Balmain, and Vent Vert could be considered fougère, definitely. Vent Vert is very much in the fougère wheelhouse, even if it's not, it's technically a sheep. You get my point. These things, a lot of times, get blurry, okay? They get very blurry because materials end up being kind of homologated between genres anyway. So the fougère that we know today, that we're more familiar with, really came about in the late 60s through the 70s. The most famous one is probably Cyr Irish Moss by Cyr, a German shaving accoutrement brand. And they created Cyr Irish Moss in 1968 or 69, I believe. And that was a much more patchouli focused rosewood, sharp green, soapy. And a lot of guys loved that. Loved it so much that Colgate-Palmolive actually slid right on in, kind of stole that fragrance and made a soap that you're familiar called Irish Spring. Although it's called like Irishish Frühling in German, then translated into English it becomes Irish Spring. So Cyr Irish Moss and Irish Spring soap together, those two products kind of created the modern aromatic fougère that was later turned into a proper fragrance by Paco Rabanne. See, it all comes together now. See, this whole 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon wearing cologne, it's all pieced together, So Paco Rabanne, with its Pour Homme fragrance, was building up from what other fougères in the past had done. building up from what was done by British Sterling through Spital Textron, built up what was done by Brood, Jade East, through Leeming, High Karate, also a Leeming Pfizer product. Maybe it was Swank that did Jade East. I think Swank did Jade East, but you get my point. Those dime store, dollar store, drugstore type of fougères were kind of foreshadowing what was to come. Sir Irish Moss, you know, our spring soap, all of those things were foreshadowing what was to come with Paco Rabanne. Paco Rabanne took all of that stuff and brought it up market. It took all of those shaving things, wet shaving, soapy green, fougère, patchouli, rosewood stuff, and kind of went, whoosh, here is the noble version of it. So then you get Paco Rabanne Pour Homme, 1973, considered the world's first aromatic fougère. That's debatable. I mean, again, what about Acqua di Selva? You know, what about Pinot Silvestri? But that's okay. We'll let them think it was the first one, okay? We'll just let them pretend. As long as they're not hurting anybody, they can pretend. So Paco Rabanne Pour Homme, that fragrance ended up becoming heavily copied, and a lot of the evolution of the fougère in general comes from copying, and also Rands and Me Too, and you know, all of these other brands seeing a men's market product become very successful. And you know, they don't like taking risks. The men's fragrance market in general is notorious for not taking risks. So you'll see way more copying and plagiarism on the men's counter than you will on the women's. It's just the way it goes, folks. We don't get a lot of variety, guys. We get 10 versions of the same thing by 10 different brands because they all want a piece of that money, right? So Paco Rabanne got copied a whole bunch. And then, of course, that led us to Azzaro Pour Homme, which was like the next step in the aromatic fougère revolution. Both of these two fragrances contained a material called dimetol and dihydromercenol, which were synthetics that create a soapy, filmy, somewhat aqueous vibe with a bubble bath vibe. And we would see that ingredient increase in future fougères until the fresh fougère, which is another adjunct, by the way, would come into being. And the fresh fougère really started with Azzaro Pour Homme, but the most exemplary fresh fougère is probably Drakkar Noir by Guy Laroche in 1982. That fragrance is probably the first true fresh fougère, and from Drakkar Noir, more copying. It comes full circle because Parfum Houbigant, who is still barely clinging onto life after 100 years, decided to make another fougère called Duc de Vervins in 85, and that fragrance really imitated Drakkar Noir a whole lot, just greener, more lemon verbena, stuff like that. So if you want the noir taken out of Drakkar Noir and you want more green, more citrus, then Houbigant Duc de Vervins came out in 85. Now, I know Luc Couturier called that a sad little fougère. He was very unhappy. And I guess, you know, to be fair, if you smell the original Fougère Royale, the fragrance that started it all, effectively, the fragrance that created this genre, and then you look at Duc de Vervins, and you're like, this is the same brand? How? One is so much simpler and more commercial in style. But, again, a century makes a big difference. You know, things had become more commercial anyway by the mid-'80s, you know. The days of big, bold, artistic, statement-making fragrances that didn't sell well and sat in discounters was coming to an end by the end of the 80s because shareholders and corporatism and all that was like, no, we want the more money. Okay, we want the more money. So the fresh fougère would become the prevailing style that most of you guys know today through Eternity by Calvin Klein, Curve by Liz Claiborne, Paco Rabanne would hit back with Excess. And it would continue going all the way up to present day with stuff like Mont Blanc Legend, Abercrombie Fitch Fierce Cologne, Parfum de Marly Percival, you name it, the fougères are still going. But the thing about the genre is, no matter what kind of fougère you're talking about, whether it's aromatic, whether it's an old musky one from the turn of the 20th century, or a fresh one from the last 20 years, they all have the same thing in common. They all have citrus, some kind of lavender and or geranium, some kind of tonka and or oak moss together. That basic structure is a fougère, and it all reminds you of this general woodland arboreal kind of vibe. And that's what you're supposed to think when you smell a fougère. And this has been the On List.